The leather briefcase sat in the back seat like it didn't belong there. Which it didn't. Chik Okafor stared at it through his rearview mirror, both hands still wrapped around the steering wheel even though the engine had been off for 5 minutes. The street outside was quiet. The rain had stopped. Lagos was holding its breath the way it sometimes does in the small hours, between the last drunk leaving the bar and the first market woman setting up her stall. 11 years. Chik had been driving taxis for 11 years, and in that time he had seen every kind of person climb in and climb out of his back seat. The rich ones who talked on their phones the entire ride and never once looked at his face, the tired ones who fell asleep before they'd given him the address, the drunk ones, the crying ones, the ones who asked him questions about his life as though they genuinely wanted to know. People left things behind sometimes. Umbrellas, mostly. Phones. Once, a pair of women's shoes that had been placed very deliberately on the floor, and Chik had decided not to think too hard about that. But no one had ever left anything like this. The passenger tonight had been on his phone from the moment he got in. English so precise and crisp it sounded almost theatrical, the kind of accent you picked up when you'd been educated somewhere that cost real money. He'd barked instructions into the phone the whole way to the Echo Hotel. Instructions about meetings, about documents that needed to be signed before a certain deadline, about someone who was going to be very disappointed if a particular number wasn't reached by Thursday. When they'd pulled up to the entrance, he'd tossed 500 naira onto the front seat without turning around and walked into the building. The whole thing had taken 90 seconds. Chik had reached back almost without thinking. The briefcase was heavy, real leather, the kind that cost more than 3 months of what he earned. And near the handle, embossed in gold, were 2 letters. He knew those initials. Everyone in Lagos knew those initials. Obiora. Real estate. Shipping. Banks. A man whose face appeared on billboards along the expressway, whose name moved through traffic and markets and Sunday church like a low current of electricity. He owned half of Victoria Island and had the kind of relationships with powerful people that were never written down anywhere but were more binding than any contract. Obiora had left his briefcase in Chik's taxi. Chik clicked the briefcase open. Inside, documents with signatures in English and French that he couldn't fully read, property deeds for addresses in Banana Island and Lekki Phase 1, a checkbook bearing the Zenith Bank logo printed in silver, and cash. Stacks of it. 1,000 naira notes bound with rubber bands, 20 stacks in total, each one thick with 50 notes. He counted quietly. 1 million naira. Sitting in his taxi. On Ahmadu Bello Way, under a street light that flickered every few seconds like it was thinking about giving up. His phone buzzed. A new ride request. He ignored it. His daughter's school fees were 3 days overdue. His wife, Enozi, had a lump in her breast that the local clinic had waved away, but the hospital, the real hospital, had said needed a biopsy. The biopsy needed money they didn't have. His landlord had already left 2 written warnings about the rent. 1 stack from this briefcase would cover the school fees and keep the landlord quiet for another month. 2 stacks would cover the biopsy and leave something left over. 3 stacks and Enozi could have the surgery and they could eat properly for the first time in months. His phone rang. Not a ride request this time. The name on the screen read, Enozi. He let it ring. It rang again. He answered. Chik. Her voice was worn thin, the way fabric gets when it's been washed too many times. Where are you? You said you'd be home by 9. I had a long-distance passenger. I'm sorry. Silence. Then quieter. The hospital called again. They said if we don't bring 150,000 by Friday, they'll cancel the appointment. Chik closed his eyes. I'll find it. How? Her voice cracked on the word. How, Chik? We've borrowed from everyone we know. Your brother doesn't pick up your calls anymore. My mother, she stopped. Started again. Our daughter asked me today why we don't eat chicken anymore. She's 7 years old. She shouldn't have to notice things like that. The line went dead. Chik sat in the silence of his taxi and stared at the briefcase on the passenger seat. He opened it again. He pulled out 1 stack and held it in his palm. 50,000 naira. 3 weeks of work, sitting in the cup of his hand like it weighed nothing. 3 stacks. 150,000. Enozi's surgery. A man like Obiora Admi wouldn't even notice. Men like that lost more money down the back of their sofas than Chik made in a year. It would be, in any practical sense, invisible. The thought arranged itself in his mind with a quiet reasonableness that frightened him a little. He started the engine. He drove slowly through Victoria Island, past the high perimeter walls and the drowsing security guards, past the luxury cars that sat in driveways like a different species of object entirely, past the life that existed on the other side of a wall he had never been invited through. Then out of Victoria Island and into the streets he knew, narrower streets, darker, where the smell of open gutters mixed with the smoke from a late-night suya cellar and children slept on mats outside their parents' rooms because the heat inside was worse than the heat outside. He parked in front of his building, 3 stories, peeling paint, balconies going rusty at the corners, and carried the briefcase upstairs. Enozi was still awake. She sat on the edge of their mattress, which lay on the floor because they had never been able to afford a bed frame they both agreed on. Their daughter, Adana, slept on a small mat in the corner, covered with a bright cotton wrapper. A single bulb hung from the ceiling. Enozi looked up when Chik came in. Her eyes were red. "You're finally back." "Yes." She saw the briefcase. Her expression shifted. "What is that?" "A passenger left it in the taxi." She stood slowly. "What kind of passenger?" "A rich one." She walked closer, studying it. "Did you open it?" He hesitated, then nodded. "What's inside?" "Documents. And money." Her breathing changed. She knelt down and opened the briefcase herself. When she saw the stacks of cash, her hand flew to her mouth. She looked up at Chik and then back down. She began pulling out the stacks, counting with shaking hands. When she finished, she looked at him again. 1 million naira. "Yes." She stood, holding one of the stacks. "Do you understand what this means? Do you understand what we could do with this?" "It's not ours." She stared at him. "What?" "It belongs to someone. I have to return it." The look on her face moved through shock and arrived at something harder. "Return it?" "Chik, are you serious?" This man was careless enough to leave 1 million naira in a taxi. That is his problem, not yours. "Enozi." "No." She cut him off with a sharpness that wasn't anger exactly. It was desperation wearing anger's face. "No, Chik. I'm done. I'm done praying and fasting and believing that something is going to change. I'm done watching our daughter go to sleep hungry. I'm done lying in bed at night feeling this thing growing in my chest and knowing we can't afford to find out what it is." Her voice broke open at the edges. "This is the answer, Chik. This is what we've been praying for. And you want to give it back to a man who didn't even know it was gone." Chik looked at her. At the exhaustion in her face, the desperation in her eyes, the particular kind of suffering that comes from loving someone and watching them drown and being unable to do anything about it. "What if it was our money?" he said quietly. "What if I'd left something in someone's car and they kept it? What would you want them to do?" "I would feel stupid for being careless." "Enozi." He reached for her hand. "What do we tell Adana when she's grown? That we stole? We wouldn't be stealing. We'd be surviving. There's a difference." He pulled away gently. "There isn't." Tears filled her eyes. "So you're choosing a stranger over your own family." "I'm choosing to do the right thing." She laughed, and it was a terrible sound, not funny at all, just the sound a person makes when the thing they believed in has finally let them down. The right thing doesn't pay hospital bills, Chik. The right thing doesn't feed your daughter. The right thing doesn't keep the lights on. She picked up the briefcase and held it toward him. "If you return this money, I swear to you, I will never forgive you." The room was very quiet. Adana stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. Chik looked at his wife. At the woman he had married 9 years ago when they were both young enough to believe that love solved most problems. At the woman who had stood beside him through every failure and every broken promise without ever actually leaving. He thought about what he was about to do to her. "I have to return it," he said. Enozi's face crumpled. She dropped the briefcase at his feet. She lay down on the mattress and turned her back to him, her shoulders shaking. "Then go," she whispered. "Go and return it. And when you come back empty-handed, don't expect me to still be here." Chik stood over the briefcase for a long moment. Then he picked it up and walked out. He drove to a quiet spot near the lagoon and parked with the engine off. The water caught the moonlight and scattered it. He sat there for a long time, watching it, letting the weight of everything settle. He thought about Enozi. About Adana asking why they didn't eat chicken anymore. About the hospital's deadline. About the landlord's letters. He thought about opening the briefcase one final time and taking just enough, just what they needed to survive, and telling himself that wasn't really stealing, that it was the universe making an adjustment. And then he thought about his father. His father had been a carpenter. A quiet man who built furniture for neighbors in their area and charged less than he should have because he didn't like making people feel poor. He died when Chik was 15, before Chik had really understood him. But before he died, he'd said something that had stayed lodged in Chik's memory the way certain things do, not because you think about them often, but because they're there when you need them. A man's wealth is not in his pocket, his father had said. It's in his name. If people can't trust your name, you have nothing. Chik started the engine and drove toward Victoria Island. The Admi estate sat behind 12-foot walls topped with electric wire. 2 security men in black uniforms stood at the gate, earpieces in, the particular stillness of men who are paid to look like they expect trouble. One of them approached Chik's window before he'd fully stopped, already frowning. "What do you want?" "I need to see Mr. Admi." The guard's frown deepened. "At this time of night? You and 500 other people. Move before I call police. I have something that belongs to him. If it's a business proposal, come during office hours. This is a man's private." Chik held up the briefcase through the window. The guard stopped mid-sentence. His expression changed completely. He stepped back and spoke rapidly into his radio. 30 seconds later, the gate slid open. They searched him twice before he got anywhere near the main building, patted him down, checked his ID, asked him questions in a way that made it clear they were deciding whether he was a threat or an idiot. He was made to wait in a small concrete room with a plastic chair and nothing else. His phone buzzed. Enozi. He didn't answer. Then a text, "If you do this, we're finished." He put the phone in his pocket. After 45 minutes, a woman appeared. Middle-aged, precise, wearing a cream-colored suit with a name badge that read Mrs. Nwosu, Chief of Staff. She looked at Chik the way people sometimes look at things they're not sure belong in the room. "You're the taxi driver?" "Yes, ma." "And you have the briefcase?" "Yes, ma." She took it from him and examined the exterior, then led him through the compound. Past fountains that looked like they'd been designed by someone who thought water should have opinions. Past gardens with flowers Chik couldn't name. Past cars arranged in a circular driveway, each one representing more money than Chik would earn in the next 20 years combined. Inside, the house was something Chik had no real framework for. Marble floors. Ceilings high enough that the chandeliers hanging from them looked small. Paintings on the walls that Chik couldn't evaluate but could feel the weight of. Mrs. Nwosu stopped him in front of a heavy wooden door, knocked once, entered, and closed it behind her. Chik stood in the hallway alone, holding nothing now, feeling very clearly that he was a stain on a white shirt. Voices inside, Mrs. Nwosu's and a man's, deeper, with the flat controlled tone of someone who was irritated but had long ago learned to keep irritation on a short leash. Then the door opened. "He'll see you." The office was enormous. One full wall was glass, the city spread out beyond it like a circuit board. A desk of dark wood sat at the center, polished to a depth that made it look like you could fall into it. Behind it sat Obiora Admi. He was older than Chik had expected. Late 50s, maybe 60. Gray at the temples, lines in his face that had been earned rather than given. He wore a white agbada embroidered with gold thread, and when he looked up at Chik, his eyes were the eyes of someone who had spent decades reading people quickly and accurately. "You're the driver?" "Yes, sir." "And you have my briefcase?" Mrs. Nwosu placed it on the desk. Obiora opened it with the methodical care of someone who already knows what he'll find but needs the confirmation anyway. He checked the documents, flipped through the contracts, looked at the checkbook, counted the cash with the practiced speed of a man for whom cash in large quantities was simply a category of object. Then he closed the briefcase and looked at Chik. "You know what's inside?" "Yes, sir." And you didn't take anything? The pause. No, sir. Nothing at all. No, sir. Not one note. Obiora leaned back in his chair. He studied Chik for a long moment, the worn shirt, the scuffed shoes, the faded jeans with a small tear at the knee, and the silence stretched out until it had weight. Then he laughed. Not a polite, managed laugh. A real one, deep and sudden and with something raw in it, almost like recognition. You're either the most honest man in Lagos, Obiora said, or the biggest fool. Chik didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Obiora stood and walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from Chik. What's your name? Chik Okafor, sir. How long have you been driving taxis? 11 years, sir. Married? Yes, sir. A wife and a daughter. Obiora nodded slowly. And your wife, she knows you're here returning this? Chik's throat tightened. Yes, sir. What did she say? Chik looked at the floor. I know, Obiora said quietly. She told you not to come. Chik said nothing. But you came anyway. The pause. Why? Because it's not mine, sir. Obiora walked to the glass wall and looked out at the city. Lagos at night, lit and alive and indifferent. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, gone somewhere more private. My father was a taxi driver. He let that sit. In 1983, my father drove a taxi in Surulere. We lived in one room. My mother sold vegetables in the market. I was the eldest of 6 children. He paused. One day my father picked up a Lebanese businessman. The man left a bag in the back seat. My father opened it. Inside was $20,000 in cash. Chik stood very still. My father brought it home. He showed it to my mother. She wept. She begged him to keep it, just enough to move us out of that room, enough to send me and my brothers to proper school. She said God had sent the money, that it was a blessing. Obiora's voice grew quieter, more careful. My father refused. He said it wasn't ours. He said taking it would make us thieves, and that thieves never truly prosper. My mother was furious. She didn't speak to him for 3 days. In the silence that followed, Chik could hear his own heartbeat. The next morning, my father returned the bag. The Lebanese man was stunned. He asked my father why he hadn't kept it. My father told him, because it would teach my children that stealing is acceptable when you're desperate. Obiora turned from the window. The Lebanese man owned an oil company. He was so moved by my father's honesty that he offered him a job. A real job, security supervisor. Not much by some measures, but stable and legitimate. My father accepted. 5 years later, that same man sponsored my scholarship to study business in London. When I came back, he introduced me to people. People who trusted me because they trusted my father's name. He paused. Everything I have built started from the moment my father returned a bag he didn't have to return. The office was very quiet. Chik felt something move in his chest that he couldn't name exactly, grief and recognition and something that might have been relief, though he wasn't sure yet what he was relieved about. Obiora returned to his desk and sat. He opened his checkbook and began writing without looking up. Your wife was right to be angry with you, he said. You came here carrying $1 million naira that could have solved all your immediate problems. You're leaving with nothing. He tore off the check and held it out. Chik took it. Then he saw the number. His hands began to shake. Sir, I can't accept this. This is too much. You can. And you will. Obiora's voice was firm without being unkind. That is not charity. That is payment. You returned something that was mine when no one was watching and nothing was stopping you from keeping it. That kind of character is not common. He paused. I'm not finished. He pressed a button on the desk. Mrs. Nwosu appeared. I want you to take Mr. Okafor's details tonight. Have HR prepare an employment contract by tomorrow morning. He'll be joining us as a trainee site supervisor in the construction division. Salary starts at 250,000 naira per month. Chik's legs went uncertain beneath him. Sir, I don't understand. I have no experience in construction. You'll learn. Obiora looked at him steadily. I'm not giving you this position because I'm feeling generous, Chik. I'm giving it to you because I see something in you that I haven't seen in a very long time. My father had it. It is worth more than anything in that briefcase. He stood and extended his hand. Monday morning. 7 a.m. Don't be late. Chik shook it. His entire body was trembling. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. As he reached the door, Obiora called after him. One more thing. Chik stopped and turned. Go home to your wife. Give her the check. Tell her you understand why she wanted you to keep the money, because she was right that it would have solved your problems, and she loves your family enough to have been willing to do something she knew was wrong. Tell her that. He paused. And then tell her this. The reason you didn't keep it wasn't foolishness. It was because you are building something more valuable than money. You are building a name that your daughter will be proud to carry. That's not a small thing. Chik nodded. He couldn't speak. He walked out of the office, through the mansion, past the fountains and the gardens and the gate and the guards, and back to his taxi. He sat in the driver's seat and looked at the check in his hand for a long time. Then he started the engine and drove home. When he opened the door to their room, Enozi was still awake. Still sitting in the same position, back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up when he entered. Her face was set and closed. You actually did it, she said. You gave it back. Chik nodded. She laughed softly, not the terrible laugh from earlier, but something more defeated. So now what? Chik crossed the room and knelt down in front of her. He took the check from his pocket and placed it in her hands. She looked down. Her expression changed. What is this? Payment, he said quietly. For returning the briefcase. She stared at the number. Her hands began to shake. 500,000 naira. She looked up at him. Chik. There's more. He looked at her steadily. I have a job. A real job with the company that owns the briefcase. Starting Monday. 250,000 naira a month. Enozi covered her mouth with both hands. She looked at him, then at the check, then at him again. I don't understand. The man whose briefcase I returned, Chik said. His father was a taxi driver. His father also found money that didn't belong to him. His father also returned it. And that single decision changed everything that came after. He paused. It changed everything for his son. And now it's changing everything for us. Enozi's tears came without warning. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Chik. I was wrong. I was so frightened that You weren't wrong to want to protect our family, he said. He put his arms around her and held on. You were scared. I understood that. I understood all of it. They sat on the floor of their one-room apartment in the small hours of the morning, holding each other, crying for different reasons that had wound together into the same reason, while Adana slept in the corner with her wrapper pulled up to her chin. 6 months later, Chik stood on a construction site in Lekki wearing a yellow hard hat and a vest with a company logo on the chest. He was no longer a taxi driver. He was a trainee site supervisor, learning how buildings rose from the ground one decision at a time. He worked 12-hour days. He studied at night. He asked questions until the engineers around him got mildly tired of answering, and then he asked more. He learned the language of blueprints and load tolerances and soil composition. He learned it the way a man learns something when he understands that his family's future is the reason for every page he turns. One afternoon, Obiora visited the site without announcement. He found Chik standing with the lead engineer over a set of drawings, pointing at a measurement that didn't match the construction specifications. Right there, Chik was saying, the number on the drawing is different from what's on the ground. The engineer looked, then looked again. You're right, he said, with the particular surprise of someone who didn't expect to be corrected. Good catch. Obiora watched from a distance. Later, he called Chik into the site office. You're doing well. I'm trying, sir. I want to tell you something I didn't tell you that night you came to my house. Obiora leaned back. The Lebanese businessman, the one who helped my father, he died 10 years ago. But before he died, he called me to his bedside. He told me something. What did he say, sir? He said that the day my father returned his money was the day he learned something he had never forgotten. He said, integrity cannot be purchased. It can only be recognized. And when you recognize it, you invest in it. Obiora looked at Chik steadily. That is what I am doing with you, Chik. I am investing in your integrity. Because men who have it are rare, and rare things are worth more than they cost. Chik's throat tightened. I won't let you down, sir. I know you won't. 3 years after the night of the briefcase, Chik stood in front of a house in Ejigbo. 3 bedrooms. A small yard with a gate that actually locked. It wasn't large by any measure that a man like Obiora would recognize, but it was his, paid for with money he had earned, not taken. Enozi stood beside him, healthy, the surgery long behind her, the lump that had terrified them both removed and gone. Adana, 10 years old now, ran through the empty rooms deciding which one would be hers, her voice bouncing off walls that still smelled of fresh paint. That evening, after Adana had gone to sleep in her own room for the first time in her life, Chik and Enozi sat on their small balcony. Do you ever think about that night? Enozi asked. Every day. She was quiet for a moment. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd kept the money? Chik considered it honestly. We would have survived. Maybe for a year, maybe 2. But eventually it would have run out and we'd have been back where we started, except we'd have done something we couldn't take back. He paused. Because I returned it, we didn't just survive. We changed. Everything changed. Enozi rested her head on his shoulder. I'm proud of you, she said softly. I'm proud of the man you are. Inside the house, Adana slept in her own bed, in her own room, in a house her father had built not by taking something that didn't belong to him, but by giving back what did. And somewhere across the city, behind 12-foot walls, Obiora Admi sat in his study and thought about his father, about a taxi driver in Surulere who had returned a bag he didn't have to return, and about the invisible thread that connects one generation's integrity to the next generation's opportunity. About how character moves through time like that, carrying what it carries, arriving in unexpected places. The briefcase was never the real test. The real test was what Chik chose to do in the dark, in the silence, with no one watching and nothing stopping him. The reward was not what he received. It was who he became. Chik didn't just return a briefcase that night. He returned to the man his father had spent 15 years quietly building him to be. And in doing so, he gave his daughter the one thing that no amount of money, taken or earned, could ever fully replace. A father whose name means something. Because here is what most people misunderstand about wealth. It is not only what you accumulate. It is also what you refuse to compromise to get it. The account you keep with yourself, in the moments when no one else is keeping count, is the account that determines everything else. The question this story leaves you with isn't whether Chik made the right choice. It's whether you know what you would have done, sitting in that taxi with the briefcase in your lap, your wife's health on the line, your daughter asking questions you don't want to have to answer, and 1 million naira sitting in your hands with no witnesses and no consequences. Character is not what you perform when people are watching. It's what you choose when they're not. And that choice, quiet, private, made in a flickering light on an empty street, is the only inheritance that doesn't depreciate. If this story made you sit with something you needed to sit with, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, stories about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices in the moments that actually counted. And leave a comment with one word that describes what you would have done that night. Because your answer matters. Not to anyone else. To you.